I hope you're enjoying the new material I've put together on recessions. These are definitely challenging times for us all, and so my goal is to be a source of useful educational information that you can find actionable. Previously, we covered what a recession is and also how to prepare for a recession. In this video, in this recession series, we're going to answer the question on everyone's mind, and that is, are we in fact heading into a recession? So please stay tuned. Hey guys, welcome back. It's Phil from Build My ROI, where we empower you with the mindset and financial skills that you need to build and grow your wealth. If you're new here, make sure you click that subscribe button below and like and share this video if you find value in our content. Let's dive in. The economic cycle has transitioned from expansion to slowdown and could potentially transition further into contraction, depending on how things evolve in the coming months. As I explained in the What is a Recession video, the Federal Reserve sets monetary policy through its dual mandate of ensuring both inflation and unemployment in the economy remain checked. The Fed lowers inflation by raising the discount rate and using its other tools, such as cutting back on open market operations. The effect of these actions is to slow down an overheated economy, bearing in mind the effect takes 6 to 9 months to show up. And this is how the Fed inadvertently could trigger a recession. Their challenge, therefore, is really striking a very fine balance between slowing down an overheated economy or triggering a contraction. Because of the uncertainty of the continuing Russia-Ukraine war and its effects on commodity prices like oil, natural gas, wheat, and so on, because of supply chain issues that have persisted in the global and US economy since the beginning of COVID, and obviously other potential unknowns, it's very challenging, and it's going to be very challenging for the Fed to slow down the economy in what is called a soft landing. That is without triggering a recession. Now, as of June 2022, here's what we know. Number one, headline inflation as of May 2022 was at 8.6%, higher than anticipated. If we drill down into this number, this is what we see. Of the 8.6% inflation of all items, the food component was 10.1%, core inflation itself was 6%, and energy was 34.6%. What we see is that annual core inflation rate in the US slowed for a second month to 6% compared to expectations of 5.9% and following a 6.2% reading in April. So from this first data point of the actual inflation rate, it is not clear whether inflation has actually peaked, though we do know that core inflation itself has actually started slowing down, as you can see from these charts. Now, the second data point is the Fed raised the discount rate in June by 0.75% or 75 basis points, the single largest rate hike since 1994, and actually the third rate since the beginning of this year. So what we see with this chart is a very interesting story, whereby essentially rate hikes, these periods where you see the blue line rising, essentially precede the gray bars, which essentially represent recessions. And so raising rates is almost a precursor to a recession. Does a raising rate cause a recession? Well, that depends on how effectively the economy slows down. And that's essentially why we want the Fed to have a soft landing rather than a hard landing. Now, more on that later, but essentially, one of the key takeaways from this graph is the gray areas, which represent recessions, come soon after or coincide almost with the raising of rates. I found actually a very interesting piece of research that Piper Sandler, which is an investment bank, has put together, which shows essentially how the economy reacts to increases in interest rates. And this is shown in this chart here. What we see is that first we see a slowdown in housing, and that's expected because as interest rates rise, demand for mortgages should fall because obviously debt becomes more expensive. Secondly, what we see is new orders also start to slow down. And the reason for that is inventories start to build up within companies. And because inventories are building up, you expect companies to sell through less. And therefore, what we see is companies start to telegraph essentially or to cut down estimates of future earnings. Then lastly, we see this flow through to the employment market, and we see companies start to lay off employees and also cut back on their hiring plans. So this HOPE, or what spells out as hope, is essentially the roadmap for how the economy responds to changes in interest rates. And therefore, we should expect to see essentially the same thing play out over the next few quarters. We should expect housing to slow down, which is what we have seen. We should expect to see inventories start to build up, as well as orders start to slow down. We've seen this with companies such as Target, who reported recently a buildup of inventories. You see profits start to decline and companies start to cut down their forecasts for future earnings, which is something we should expect to see very soon. And obviously, we've also heard that companies are starting to lay off employees, and that's the last step. The next data point we want to take a look at is what's happening to GDP on a quarter-by-quarter basis. Now, the Philly Fed puts together a series of forecasts, and what we see in this chart is the revised forecast for Q2 as was released on May 13th. In this chart, we see that essentially real GDP has been revised downwards from 4.2% to 2.3% for the second quarter. Keep in mind that the first quarter, the economy actually contracted and had negative GDP. Again, for Q3, the forecasters have a decline in GDP to 2.5% versus a previous estimate of 3.0. What this means is essentially based on the interest rates hikes, 3 of which have happened this year, we see this decline happening. And this is essentially a positive sign that these increases in rates are having some positive effect in terms of slowing down the economy. Number 4, the next item that we will look at and want to make sure we understand correctly is what's going on with the unemployment picture, because what this does, it gives us a sense of what's going on in terms of slack in the labor market. Now, unemployment seems to have leveled off at about 3.6% and is almost certainly increasing, with announcements daily now from companies of layoffs coming from all across the United States. Remember, the Fed is trying to create slack, like I said, in the economy by, in effect, increasing the unemployment rate. So we have to watch these numbers. The faster it increases, the higher the likelihood we are to a recession. Looking at this chart from the Federal Reserve, we see the decline and leveling off towards the tail end, towards the rightmost part of the chart in 2022. The next indicator we're going to look at is the spread between the 10-year Treasury and the 2-year Treasury. And essentially, what we're looking for here is whether short-term yields are essentially higher than long-term yields. What this represents is what's called an inversion, and essentially the yield curve having inverted is a precursor, not always, but sometimes is essentially a leading indicator of a recession to come. And we can see that in the following chart. Now, if we look at this chart, what we see is that anytime the blue line goes below 0, essentially that represents an inversion of the yield curve. And what that means is that short-term rates are actually higher than long-term rates. And what you see is that once the line goes negative, it precedes a gray area, which essentially is the recession, that gray bar that you see there. You see this happening in 2008 to essentially 2009. And obviously it's happened again just before 2020. And we've seen it happen again in 2022, actually, at least one time and potentially a second time. So that is another sign to watch out for. The next question we need to ask ourselves, what's the Fed's track record as far as soft landings are concerned? And what we see there when we look at the data is that 3 out of the last 9 rate hikes resulted in soft landings. The other 6 have actually resulted in recessions. And this is coming out of research from Northern Trust, and I'll put a link to this below. What this means essentially is it's going to be very challenging for Chairman Powell to create the conditions and essentially the outcome that he's looking for, which is essentially a slow, gradual slowdown of the economy without really triggering a severe contraction. The bottom line, are we headed into a recession? Well, if we take sort of this mosaic now that we have of these data points, one thing we can say is that we're not yet in a recession. And barring any unexpected exogenous shocks in the second half of 2022, at the moment it appears that the economy is poised to slow down and unemployment looks like it's going to increase as well. It's also not clear that the Fed can engineer a so-called soft landing, especially based on its history, and that is more likely to result essentially in a hard landing, also known as a recession. And then finally, as far as timing of a recession, although we will continue to monitor these macro variables, we're not in one as of yet. And as the economy slows further, it appears that the chances are more likely that a recession would really be a 2023 event, if in fact we have one. Well, I hope you found value in this research. I know this was a fairly dry and technical video, but I think it had some very important research and points that I wanted to cover. As always, please like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed this content or learned something from it. I'm working on more content, so do leave a comment if there's any particular topic in investing or personal finance that you would like me to cover. Thanks for watching, and until next time, peace.